Why can't it be controlled? Why is West Africa having so much trouble with it? Why can't they contain it? The why doesn't seem to be of a major importance to a lot of people when it comes to Africa. But I think that's where we really need to situate our focus. So today I really want to shift gears, talk about Ebola, but really put it in the context of why, and use Ebola as a way of getting at some of the other issues that modern Africa is dealing with. Modern Africa really is in a state of crisis, has been for a long time. I also want to look very quickly and talk briefly about what do we mean by modern Africa? Why is modern Africa racked with warfare and poverty? Why is modern Africa dealing with new forms of slavery? Everything from chattel slaves in the Sudan, to war brides and sex slaves in northern Nigeria, to child soldiers that we just talked about in Sierra Leone and Liberia, in Uganda, in Congo-Kinshasa, many other places in Angola, in the Republic of Congo. The list goes on and on. So why are these forms of slavery emerging on a continent where slavery was abolished, theoretically, more than 180 years ago? Finally, I'd like to really briefly examine, as I mentioned, what we mean when we say modern Africa. This is a course, I'm teaching a course right now in Vancouver, and the title of the course is Modern Africa from Imperialism to Independence. I think the whole term modern Africa is so flawed that we really need to sort of examine it and understand it a little bit better. So anyway, through the 1990s, I worked as a war correspondent for the Associated Press, and I worked in some of the worst places imaginable. I mean, the 1990s is pretty much referred to generally as Africa's lost decade. You went from the 60s and independence and this euphoria about being freed, and now we got rid of the colonial powers. And then the 70s started to see this decline and things got worse. The 80s, you had the IMF coming in and imposing all these structural adjustment reforms and whatnot. And then the 90s, the wheels just came off, and literally Africa lost a decade. So I think, being a correspondent in the 90s, I was privy to some pretty horrific scenarios. And unfortunately, as a war correspondent, that was my primary job. People always ask me, Ian, why didn't you cover the good things in Africa? Why don't we ever hear about nice cultural events or positive developments in Africa? The tragic story, honest truth is, I felt as a journalist, if I focused on something positive going on in Africa, which I wish I could have, but had I done that, I think Africa gets so neglected that the people that need to help the continent, they would just ignore it more than they already do, which is the great tragedy of Africa. Anyway, on Deadline, I want to make a confession that on Deadline, it's a necessary evil to define the day's news events in black and white. Unfortunately, there's very little room for the nuanced gray, those ambiguous areas where we can play with what's actual fact and fiction and whatnot. The news is not neatly packaged in black and white, or it is neatly packaged in black and white. There's no room for interpretation. But as a scholar, I've been trained, we're not supposed to fall prey to simple answers. But where does Africa and Ebola have to do with this? Africa and the crisis of modernity is concerned, as I'm concerned. I'm going to take that issue of black and white and no gray zone, and I'm going to break that rule. I'm going to bend it for a while as I discuss these issues a bit. I'm a historian of Africa since the Enlightenment. And as such, to me, it's an inescapable reality that many of Africa's lingering crises of the modern state, if you will, stem all the way back to the Enlightenment. And most of the problem from the Enlightenment stems from this notion of we've created this paradigm of us and them. The them being Africa, the us being the European non-Africans. That paradigm was first defined by Edward Said, who termed it as Orientalism. It's this idea of othering somebody who's non-European, non-white. It's had such phenomenal damage on the continent. For sub-Saharan Africa, the us-them paradigm was established first in 1441 by Antônio Gonçalves. This man, he was a Portuguese explorer. He stopped in Western Sahara, and while he was there, he picked up one man and one woman, and he took them back to Portugal, and he gave them to Prince Henry, the navigator, as a gift. He gave two people as a gift. So to me, this objectification, this commodification of human beings marks the start of the Atlantic slave trade. 4 centuries of human travesty in which between 10 and 15 million people were being sold as for bondage to benefit, not Africa, and not even Europe, but to benefit the New World and the plantations of the New World owned by Americans and Europeans in America and in the West Indies. The slave trade wreaked havoc on the socio-political, demographic, and economic structures of the Upper Guinea coast. And that's where today's Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea are located. Now, I'm not suggesting that the slave trade is connected directly to the Ebola crisis, not at all. What I'm suggesting, though, is that Africa's troubles began with this early contact with Europe. In 1972, the Afro-Caribbean scholar Aimé Césaire wrote, and I quote, "The great historical tragedy of Africa has been not so much that it was late in making contact with the rest of the world, as the manner in which that contact was brought about. That Europe began to propagate at a time when it had fallen into the hands of the most unscrupulous financiers and captains of industry." Now, interestingly to me, Césaire was not talking about the slave trade. In fact, he's talking about the period of contact between Europe and Africa right after the slave trade. By the end of the 18th century, the Enlightenment was finally starting to take hold. Thinkers from Europe and the United States were coalescing to discuss concepts of human liberty in the context of bondage. However, even as Thomas Jefferson was espousing the unalienable truth that all mankind was created equal, that truth was still locked up in a racial hierarchy that emerged in part from the slave trade. English philosopher John Locke, the purported father of modern human rights, certainly believed that in his own words when he spoke of natural rights and freedoms for mankind. But it was a mankind that was seen through the eyes of the elite members of European society, who defined mankind only along racial lines. The question to me then isn't how to define natural rights and freedoms, but how do we define mankind? In other words, who is worthy of these natural rights? Although it may be taken as given today that humans of all races and genders ought to be free and equal. That's not necessarily the case. Certainly wasn't the case in Locke's world. Gender was never even considered. It was a man's world. And non-Europeans weren't considered. It was a white person's world. Besides, if you look at Locke's record, he was a very strong proponent of slavery himself. Everyone thinks about John Locke and modernity and human rights and whatnot. Well, John Locke is also one of the very first investors in the Royal African Company. This was the slave trading superpower of the British Empire in the 16th and 17th century. Also, Locke was the man who helped to draft the Carolina Constitution for colonial Carolina, which affirmed landholders' rights to own slaves and masters to be in control of slaves. So John Locke, yes, he's the ideal and the father of modernity. He's also the man who reified and believed in the idea of slavery and bondage. But Locke's ideas did go on to inform many of the 18th and 19th century Enlightenment thinkers. Where human liberty was concerned, people like Immanuel Kant, David Hume, Friedrich Hegel, and Thomas Jefferson, they all recognized the notion of human freedom and liberty. But they all did so within that same racial construct of mankind and liberty. Now, what does this have to do with Ebola, war, slavery, in modern Africa? Quite simply, these early perceptions of sub-Saharan Africa and its various populations continue to shape Africa's reality. And that's how we see Africa today. Africa today continues to be on the margins of modernity, a legacy, I believe, of the continent's subjugation as a source of slave labor and the suppression of African forms of independent expression, creativity, commerce, and innovation. By the mid-19th century, though, the European abolitionists finally did prevail. They successfully managed to outlaw slavery and the slave trade. However, we need to be aware of the fact that their success was only in part due to humanitarian ideals driven by the Quakers and evangelical Christians. If we look very closely, the fact that slavery was finally outlawed, that has a lot to do with economic models. At the time that discussions were really coming up about abolishing slavery, that's when Europe was exploring new ideas of industrialization. Plantation owners, the main opponents of abolition, they began losing economic and political clout. Slavery was no longer the optimal profit-generating model. Emerging industrial capitalists in London and Paris and Berlin, these were the new masters of the universe. They were the ones who would determine the fate of a new generation of laborers, both wage and slave, in Africa. The abolition of slavery ultimately served as a catalyst for Europe to take over Africa. So we have this trope that abolition of slavery was great, but it also resulted in the fact that Europe went rushing in to get involved in Africa. That was the catalyst for Africa, for Europe to say, we need to get into that continent. So there's a very dualistic notion of getting rid of slavery. Okay, so what we've got now is the Europeans are going in. You've got people like Cecil Rhodes from Britain and King Leopold II from Belgium going into Africa to acquire land and the continent's resources. What they wanted now was palm oil to oil industrial machinery for cooking and for lamps. They wanted rubber, especially rubber in the Congo, for newly popularized pneumatic tires for automobiles. They wanted copper for telegraph wires. All these things that were in abundance on the continent in Africa. And of course they wanted gold, which eventually became the source of the monetary standard for industrialized states in the 19th century, and diamonds in South Africa. By the 1880s, Europe began carving up the continent. When once you had African kingdoms like the Great Zimbabwe or the Mali Empire, or the Songhai, or the Buganda, or the Santi, now you have vast swaths of European-controlled Africa. You got French West Africa, or German East or West Africa, the Congo Free State, British East Africa. Africa was no longer African. Africa was now European. The only states to retain their independence during this period were Liberia and Abyssinia, today's Ethiopia. By the start of World War I, Europe controlled more than 90% of Africa and all of its continents, and the continent's tickets to economic success, self-sufficiency, and prosperity. Europe's drive to dominate Africa also stunted Africa's ability to develop its own manufacturing base. In the end, for centuries, Europe took all that Africa had to offer, from its dignity to its people, its cultures, its history, and finally, its resources. Adding insult to injury, Europe's newly found industrial economies produced all the consumer products that Africa needed in order to rapidly become a modern society. So Europe now taking all the goods away from Africa, taking the things for manufacturing, making end products and selling them back to Africa. So it's this double whammy on Africa by the Europeans. What the Europeans did, though, is because this is also coinciding with abolition, so the Europeans were there saying, well, no, we need to do this. We're civilizing the continent. That was the language of the day, civilizing. It was the duty of advanced European societies, they argued, to bring literacy and progress, to bring modernity to poor, backward Africa. European scholars like Reginald Copeland saw the colonization of Africa as a trusteeship. Civilization of the African other was the white man's burden, in Kipling's words. And so through the early decades of the 20th century, Europe's colonial domination of Africa became referred to as the modernizing project. This was accepted conventional wisdom well into the post-colonial period. Europe's imperialist domination of Africa may well have been a modernizing project, but at this point it's worth asking. We need to ask ourselves, what was it that Europe was modernizing, or who was it that Europe was modernizing? Think about taking things away to build European industry from Africa. Who was being modernized and at whose expense? Excuse me. Later on, as the study of African history developed through the latter decades of the 20th century, a much darker story began to unfold. Increasingly, it became clear throughout the continent European imperialists were murdering, they were maiming, they were enslaving Africans by the millions. In southern Africa, for example, Cecil Rhodes used the Gatling gun and later the Maxim gun with great efficiency to virtually wipe out entire kingdoms like the Matabele Kingdom in today's Zimbabwe. He did this basically so that the British South Africa Company would have exclusive and unfettered access to the region's gold mines south of the Zambezi River. German imperialists murdered tens of thousands of Ngoni villagers in today's Tanzania. After the Africans resisted colonial rule in a revolt known as the Maji Rebellion. I just confused Maji with the fish Mahi. Anyway. In the first years of the 20th century, Southwest Africa, today's Namibia, German colonial commander Luther von Trotha essentially brought the Herero population onto the edge of extinction. It was one of the very first episodes of genocide in the historic era. Von Trotha drove the Herero off their native lands. He poisoned their water. If any were seen on German claimed territory, they were either shot or hanged summarily. And during his campaign, Von Trotha also started to use concentration camps. They did medical experimentation on Herero prisoners. These were trademarked facets of Nazi Germany's final solution to eliminate Jews in Europe several decades later. But then there's the Congo Free State, which really is the ultimate example. King Leopold II created the Force Publique. This was the group that was basically enforcing colonial rule. And I should mention that the Congo Free State was not a state colony. This was King Leopold's private personal possession. He owned it as his own. It was not the Belgians that owned the colony. It was Leopold himself. So he created the Force Publique, who killed an estimated 10 million people between 1885 and 1908. These people were executed. They were worked to death. They were starved, and they became malnourished, and they were unable to fight off disease. And this was all in the name of extracting rubber and ivory to pad Leopold's fortunes. And think about it for a minute, that in the space of 23 years, Leopold's regime killed almost as many Africans as were sold into slavery over the course of 4 centuries. I'm going to come back to Leopold in a minute. But during the same period that Leopold is there, you've also got the French and the Portuguese and the British and the Germans, all ignoring their commitment to end slavery. Colonial administrators relied on slave labor and were encouraged to devise new forms of free labor in order to extract the mineral wealth they needed from the hinterlands in the interior of the continent. These were regions that lay beyond the legal reach of the European countries' own anti-slavery legislation. And during World War I, even, you've got Britain, France, and Germany using slave laborers as part of their military force. In Britain's case, they went into the hinterland just inside of the Sierra Leone colony, and they borrowed slaves from the hinterland chiefs to use during combat in the East Africa campaign and the West Africa campaigns. They were theoretically supposed to return these slaves when they were done. My understanding is they never did, because most of the people came back from conflict, moved to the cities, so they never went back to the hinterland in the first place. Anyway, the list of European atrocities and crimes that were committed against humanity in the 19th and 20th centuries in Africa go on and on. The Congolese philosopher Valentin Mudembe argued in the 1980s that Africa is an invention. So what do we need by Africa as an invention? It was an invention basically in so much that European missionaries and explorers and the industrial capitalists who scrambled into the continent in the 19th century manufactured an image of Africa as barbaric, as savage, and as backward. It was all to justify European actions and cast Africa as a place in need of saving and of European intervention. And 100 years later, when Europe granted independence to the vast majority of African colonies in the 1960s, Africa was theoretically no longer backward. It was modern. Mission accomplished. Never mind that modern Africa had been looted of all of its natural resources for almost a century, or that it inherited a frail and skeletal infrastructure. For the most part, post-colonial Africa was left with a network of disconnected rail lines and roads, designed predominantly to facilitate the transport of mineral wealth from the interior of the continent to the coastline for easy access back to Europe. What mattered in the former colonial masters was that Africa in the 1960s and 1970s had literacy. It had European-style parliaments and bureaucracies, had elections and courts. And in the better-off former colonies, they had the occasional medical clinic or school. Some even had a college or university. Like Judeo-Christian gods, Europeans had manufactured Africa into their own image. Europe had molded Africa into a modern continent. Why then did this modern Africa descend into an unparalleled crisis of the 1990s? A condition that in many instances continues to this day. I want to take a minute and look at a couple examples. I'm going to look at Sierra Leone, and then I also want to look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is formerly the Congo Free State, then it became the Belgian Congo, then it became Congo, then it became Zaire, and it's now the Democratic Republic of Congo. Many of these questions can be found in these two examples, so I want to focus on them for a minute. Let me look at Sierra Leone first. Sierra Leone can trace its history back to the eve of the American Revolution. So in November of 1775, Lord Dunmore, who was the colonial governor of Virginia at the time, he was worried that the Patriots were going to overrun Virginia and take over. So what he did was he issued this proclamation in November of 75. He basically said that, any slave, and by any slave what he really meant was any slave owned by a patriot, not British slaves. Any slave owned by a patriot that fled their master and came across the British lines and fought on behalf of the British would be granted freedom. Seemed like a great idea at the time, but the British didn't really count on losing, because what they wanted to do really was, their idea was they were going to win the war, and then they controlled these lands way off on the Indian hinterland. They would give land to the freed slaves there, or they'd be out of sight and there wouldn't be a problem. But those pesky Americans won. So now you've got thousands of black loyalists and white loyalists who are trapped at the southern tip of Manhattan in 1783. They start to be evacuated. Initially what they do is they evacuate the white loyalists to London, to colonial holdings in the West Indies, or in the vast majority went up to loyalist Canada. The black loyalists came second, and a few went to London. A lesser number ended up in Nova Scotia, the Canadian provinces of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Problem was their conditions were horrific. They were scarcely better than being slaves once again. And in London in particular, they were left up to their own devices. The black loyalists, they were called. They went from black loyalists to being the Black Poor of London. And so Granville Sharp was this famous abolitionist who really believed in the idea of creating a homeland for them. So what he did is he, through his own money and through a small grant from the Crown, he purchased a small plot of land near the Sierra Leone River. And he managed to transport about 280 black loyalists, or Black Poor of London, to this territory in Sierra Leone. It was called the Province of Freedom. It was this idealistic notion it would be self-governing. They truly would have freedom. Unfortunately, the place where unfortunately, Rebecca's trying to keep me awake. Unfortunately, the Granville Sharp found land, the land that he bought was right in the midst of the Sierra Leone River. If you look at it, you've got the Bunce Island slave fortress, and then just upriver you've got the Gambia Island slave fortress. This is a very active slave trading region, still in the midst of ongoing slave trading. So the Temne middleman, the Koyo Temne from the region that this Province of Freedom was established, they felt very threatened, and they felt that this was going to undermine their way of life, because they had been basically capturing rival Mende people and taking them to be sold at Bunce Island and whatnot. They felt threatened, so by 1789 they ultimately they razed the settlement and destroyed the Province of Freedom. Then it was rebuilt, though. In 1792, Granville Sharp wanted to find a way to bring this back to life. So he managed to get together some very prominent abolitionists who believed in the idea. And these are people that truly believed in abolition. Henry Thornton, William Wilberforce, and Thomas Clarkson. These were the people at the forefront of ending slavery and the slave trade. Unfortunately, though, they also had commercial interest, and they founded the Sierra Leone Company. And they wanted to reestablish Sierra Leone as an agro-colony, in essence, to replace the lost revenues from the American colonies they lost in the Revolution. So they had this idea that they would basically create this colony that was going to be one big, vast colony for coffee and for other produce that they'd sell back to Europe. What they did was they went to the Nova Scotian black loyalists, and they gave them an offer. They said, what we want to do, Eleni, are you here? Oh, there you are. If I'm wandering on, then please tell me.
Good.
Okay. I've lost track. I get into my Sierra Leone stuff and then I lose myself. Anyway, he went to Nova Scotia and he managed to recruit 1,200 black loyalists. They would be given free passage to Africa. They'd be given a plot of land, and then they assumed that they would go on to what Granville Sharp originally envisioned was the self-governing free land. when in fact what they did was they were put on this plot of land and then they were expected to pay rent for it. No source of income whatsoever. All they had was their land and the tools that they had to buy in the company store. So what they had to do was they had to sell their crops to the company that would pay them in credit so they could buy their tools and pay their rent. Basically, it's called debt bondage. You know, not really freedom, but the British certainly said, well, it's not slavery either. So they did sort of, to their word, live up to it, but it was a very twisted sense of giving freedom to a group. Moreover, in that same area, the British started to push further and further into the hinterland, where British law did not apply. So they continued using so-called domestic slaves to gather up materials that they would sell in the metropole back in London. By 1807, Britain did pass the Slave Trade Act. So what they did is they didn't outlaw slavery, but they outlawed the idea of the export of slaves and selling of slaves, the trade of slaves, in other words. To enforce this, they created the Royal West Africa Squadron, patrolled up and down the coast of West Africa, capturing ships that were breaking the law and liberating all the slaves that were on these ships. And they would plant them back down into this new province, into the new colony at Sierra Leone. But that wasn't really ideal. All that was an increasing number of laborers to help build the colony. So over and over, the British were actually creating alternative forms of slave labor, or unfree labor, if you will, to build the colony. So you've got this reservoir of laborers now living in Sierra Leone. In 1833, the British finally went ahead and passed the overall abolition of slavery. So now you've got liberated slaves in Sierra Leone, you've got all these new creations of unfree labor. Sierra Leone is turned into a social laboratory, if you will. So they're trying things like apprenticeships. You end slavery, you don't actually get rid of slaves, you start calling them apprentices, basically unpaid labor. So this goes on for quite some, this goes on right up until the 20th century. It took the League of Nations to actually intervene with Liberia and with Sierra Leone to finally say, this has got to end. What the British did elsewhere, because they also have colonial holdings in East Africa, and many of the other Europeans, what they did is they also imposed vagrancy laws. So all of these slaves who have been freed, you can go, you're free, but if you leave your land, you're going to be a vagrant, and you could be exiled, or you'll be punished in some form or another. So this is another way of forcing laborers to stay on the land and be tied to the land. So by and large, the whole idea of abolition is not altogether accurate. It's intriguing to sort of study this in closer detail, but it's not altogether getting rid of slavery or unfree labor, it's just renaming it. Let me shift gears. There's one interesting connection, because I want to shift now to talk about Congo, because one thing that happened in the 1890s is you've got these liberated slaves who, interestingly enough, the British called recaptives. What does that mean? These are people who have been captive to be sold into slavery, and the British are calling them recaptives. Why are they recaptive? Why aren't they just free? Well, there was this enterprising businessman, Arthur Porter Thomas, who was a merchant in the colony. And he basically cut a deal with Le Chemin de Fer de Congo, the company that was building the railway between Matadi and Leopoldville. He sold several hundred, perhaps 1,000 liberated slaves, recaptives, to work in Leopold, Congo. This is the place where there's horrific violence going on. There's the rubber tapping, the 10 million dead during this period. So you survive being captured, being put onto a slave ship, being rescued from the slave ship, taken to Sierra Leone, sold into slavery again back in the interior with Leopold in charge. Anyway, let me talk a little bit about Congo's free state under Leopold. In the 1870s, you've got King Leopold II. He creates the Africa International Association. This was, this idea was supposed to be really positive. He was really selling to the other European powers because he felt left out. All the European powers are having colonies except Leopold. So he sold it that I'm going to go in, I'm going to bring civilization to the people in Africa. It's a humanitarian issue. And so within 15 years, there was the Berlin Conference where all the European powers met together. And basically, that was the time when they carved up, okay, France, you get this, Britain, you get that, Africa, well, you don't get a seat. They didn't invite a single African to the table. They just carved up the continent and gave it to Europe. At that conference, though, they said to Leopold, you can have what you want, you can have this entire, if you look on the map of Africa, the biggest state is the Democratic Republic of Congo, the former Congo Free State. This is massive section right in the middle of the country. most resource-rich country of all. Anyway, after Leopold gets official control of it, and it's the Congo Free State, bit by bit reports from missionary groups start emerging of ongoing slavery and crimes against humanity that are being committed in Congo. These pop up in newspapers and reports in London and Paris. Finally, there's this 19th century journalist by the name of Edmund Morrell. He's a British journalist and an author, and he begins investigating some of these missionary reports. And he's able to find and trace down the fact that, yes, these crimes are actually happening, and that Leopold has amassed this fortune for himself, and ultimately for Belgium. And Belgium, you've got to realize that Belgium is this teeny country in Europe, and it's controlling a country that's probably 100, 200 times the size of itself, but it's getting filthy rich off of it. And Leopold does this through a variety of ways. He uses forced labor, kidnapping, and terror, and that ensures that his rubber tappers are meeting their weekly quotas. What he does is he kidnaps the wives of rubber tappers. They're not going to be released if they don't meet their quota of rubber each week. He kidnaps children. He does all these horrible things all in the name of making sure that the laborers who are forced laborers, these are not people that are getting a wage to do this, are meeting their quotas. Okay, by 1908, the Belgian Parliament votes that Leopold has gone over the top, this is too much, so they finally take control of the colony themselves, so it becomes the Belgian Congo. And things do improve in Congo, but marginally. Congo is one of the most abused colonies throughout the European period in Africa. It gains its independence in 1960. But even in independence, it brought relief for some people in Congo. But workers continue to be exploited. The infrastructure in the Congo is abysmal. Along the lines of Western modernity, which, remember, we're talking about the modernizing project as colonialism. The Belgians left with a few schools, I think a hospital, and absolutely no industrial manufacturing base for Congo to build on, to actually develop. So it's basically left to itself. One thing that is found out, though, it's interesting to remember that Congo goes from bad to worse, because Congo is also wealthy with the resources. Some that we didn't know were important at the time of the colonial period, but during the Cold War, we discovered that there's uranium, there's titanium, there's cobalt, there's copper. We knew about copper, but now we use copper in different ways in really powerful weapons that Moscow and Washington really want to control and have power over. So Congo goes from colonial pawn to Cold War proxy, basically. Washington and Moscow are both vying for influence. One of the tragic examples of what goes on when you've got superpowers vying for your interests is you've got elections that aren't really free. You've got the prime minister at the time, first elected prime minister, Patrice Lumumba. He was suspected of being left-leaning, so the CIA plotted to have him assassinated. CIA, in conjunction with Joseph Mobutu, who would later become Mobutu Sese Seko, had Lumumba assassinated. Anyway, so Mobutu is Washington's hand-picked leader for the Congo. And he held power and provided a whole new term of new lexicon for the English language. The word kleptocracy was basically turned for him. This man stole so much from the country, he rivals Leopold himself. Mobutu was in power from 1965 to 1997. This was a period in modern Africa, in modern African history. It came to reflect a complete decline of post-colonial African government. Corruption, big man politics, they were rampant. Development was almost non-existent, and human suffering was ubiquitous. It was not a far cry from Leopold's Congo, frankly. But in Mobutu's Congo, which he renamed Zaire, education levels plummeted, life expectancy dropped. Healthcare was little better than in Leopold's day. And Mobutu was seldom seen as he summered in Switzerland or in the French Riviera. It's suspected that Mobutu managed to embezzle somewhere between $4 and $15 billion of his own country's money. In 1996, a little-known Marxist by the name of Laurent Désiré Kabila began assembling an army in the eastern part of the country, of Zaire at the time, as well as with Rwandan Hutu refugees from the Rwandan crisis. He began marching on Kinshasa across the savannah. In 1997, he did successfully topple Mobutu's regime and take power. But this is around the same time, and I'm going to jump back and forth here for a second, so bear with me. Around the same time in Sierra Leone, across the other side of the continent, this is where we've sold liberated slaves to build a railway, remember. We're back in Sierra Leone again now. This is a guy named Johnny Paul Kuroma, who overthrows the elected government of Ahmed Tejan Kaba. This is 1997, so we're into contemporary times pretty much. So Kaba, who was elected to power, was overthrown, and it was part of a decade-long civil war that was happening in Freetown. But by having this coup, what he did was he brought the rebels for the first time right into the capital of Freetown. This is some of the things that Jenny was talking about. This is the Revolutionary United Front in conjunction with the Armed Forces Revolutionary Council. And they committed horrific crimes against humanity right in the capital of Freetown. Over the course of the conflict, Sierra Leone just sank completely to the lowest level of the UN Human Development Index. Schools were destroyed. Life expectancy dropped to about 47 years. Women, men, and children were enslaved as diamond miners. 1998, though, and I jump ahead a little bit, was a watershed year for both Sierra Leone and for Kabila's Democratic Republic of Congo. So Kaba in Sierra Leone, his government was restored in 1998, but it also triggered increased fighting in the capital and in the countryside. Rebels launched this thing called Operation Kill Every Living Thing. And this is where child soldiers were they were running the show. It was a horrific thing. I remember I was actually there at the time, and the kinds of violence these kids were forced to do was unconscionable. Meanwhile, back in Congo, you've got Kabila. In 1998, he was assassinated, which triggered a war over the presidency. And that war really is continuing right up to today. So both in Sierra Leone and in the Democratic Republic of Congo, you've got legions of children who are kidnapped and forced to become frontline combatants in that war. These are wars that already foreclosed on their collective futures. Like the slaves of Africa's slave trade and the forced laborers of Africa's colonial period, child soldiers are the unfree labor force of today's, quote, modern Africa. In the 1990s, there's one striking aspect about the Sierra Leone child soldiers that I want to talk to you a little bit about. It was basically their campaign of unfettered terror against civilian populations. These kids, and when they were kidnapped, they were kids. I saw children as young as 7, carrying AK-47s bigger than them. Anyway, these kids were kidnapped and they were forced to rape or commit murder. They would kidnap, they would take on sex slaves as brides. These were common tools of their trade. And when Kaba was running for election before he was ousted in 1996, the man's campaign slogan was, "The future's in your hands." And what the rebels did is the Revolutionary United Front, the commanders, and by commanders, I mean these are still, they're older teenagers, but they're still children, they're still child soldiers essentially. Under the leadership of Fodisenko, they came up with this concept because the future's in your hands, so they basically taught these young rebels to take a machete. And I remember interviewing one young guy, I think he was 12 at the time, I can't remember his name at the time. Anyway, he explained to me that he, with his group, would go up to people, they'd capture them. If they weren't in support of the RUF, they'd hold them down. And he would ask them straight up, do you want a short sleeve or a long sleeve shirt? And depending on the answer, that's where they decided to cut off the hand at the wrist or up at the elbow. That's how they decided where to amputate somebody's hand. So anyway, these campaigns went on, and they were just horrific. As a journalist, I was aghast, and again, I fall back to this whole flaw of journalism. I fell into black and white dialogues and discursives, and I talked about the barbarism and the violence and the savagery of Africa. How could this happen in modern Africa? Looking back now, I realize there's a precedent for this kind of mutilation and terror. This is not necessarily a wholly African thing. The precedent did not come from Africa. In fact, it comes from Europeans who raped and pillaged all the way across the Congo Free State almost 100 years earlier. In the 1890s, during military operations to quell militant uprisings against the rubber regime, Leopold distributed a predetermined number of rifle cartridges to his force publique troops in order to ensure that they wouldn't run off with the bullets or go hunting. These are really underfed people. So to ensure that they wouldn't steal the bullets or waste the bullets, Leopold's district commissioners, the Europeans on the ground in charge, basically said, to prove you use the bullet for the right reason, you need to chop off the right hand of your victim, smoke it, cure it, and bring it back to me as proof. So there is a precedent for this kind of amputation that was going on in Sierra Leone. I don't want to say that one is directly linked to the other, but I just find it too curious to ignore the fact that the hand amputation in the Congo in the 1890s and then the hand amputations in Sierra Leone in the 1990s, it just seems too coincidental. Anyway, I want to leave you with this. Recall for a moment Professor Mudembe's notion that Africa was an invention. It's a construct of how Europe saw Africa as something other than European. Is that still a valid notion today? I believe it is. But I believe it is with a caveat. When we talk about modern Africa, we're talking about the Africa Europe tried to invent in terms of civility and development and progress. Or are we talking about modern Africa, the modern Africa Europe taught Africa to be in terms of violence and crimes against humanity and untamed avarice? With great respect and admiration and deference to Mudembe, I propose that modern Africa today is no longer merely an invention. Rather, it's a reflection of Europe's image, which was imposed on Africa for almost 100 years. And that, I believe, is the crisis of modern Africa today. It is not Africa's crisis alone, though. It's our crisis. It's a crisis of humanity that transcends boundaries, culture, and gender. And that's my talk.
Thanks a lot. I'm not going to be able to do justice to the
That's a lot, I realized.
Of that, but one of the themes that I think probably a bunch of us picked up on is the idea of the legacies of the colonial era in the modern conflicts. And I was wondering if you could speak a little more to, trying to link in a way your analysis of how the exploitation of the colonial era is playing out today in terms of how the conflict resolution of the post-contemporary wars can deal with the inequities and divisions that were created amongst Africans during the colonial period that in some ways are played out in these civil wars. Because you mentioned that in Sierra Leone, for example, just to be specific, about how there was enslaving of non-returned freed slaves, enslaving of Africans who never left by both Europeans and freedmen from Jamaica or Nova Scotia or London in extractive activities and colonial activities in Sierra Leone. And it seems like some of what happened in the Civil War, tensions between the Creole and the Mende and the Timni, were partly, those divisions are still in a sense playing out in some of the political and military conflicts in Sierra Leone. And how do you see, how do you see resolving or sort of bridging some of those colonial divisions in the post-war Sierra Leone? Let's just keep it to Sierra Leone.
I wish I had answers for that. I do. There is an interesting parallel, because if you look at the way the war played out during the Civil War, it began in a part of eastern Sierra Leone, in Koinadugu.
In Kenema and Bo and yeah.
This is where the Hut Tax Rebellion of 1898. So the British imposed a tax on the hinterland, on every dwelling, basically. But it wasn't going to help the people of the hinterland. It was a tax that was basically going to collect income to go to the colony, to help develop the colony, which was a completely separate entity from the people out in the hinterland, which was a protectorate. So they didn't have the same kind of rights or infrastructure. But didn't mean that the British weren't going to take their money to help build their colony. So in 1898, in several different parts of the protectorate, there were rebellions called the Hut Tax Rebellion, or Hut Tax War. The Temne led one battle, the Mende led another, and the Creole, to a lesser degree, sort of supported and they basically got victimized because they were identified as actually being European by the indigenous Africans. So I don't know that I have an answer as to how you can, if I did, maybe I would win the Nobel Prize. This is the problem with Africa all over. I mean, all of these artificial constructs where you forced groups together in this artificial European idea of a nation state. How do you get people to get along? I mean, Nigeria tried, the Igbo tried in the 70s with the Biafran War. But then you went into the problem of the Europeans were very clever at crafting terrains where certain groups had resources. others didn't. So you don't want to, one group can't get away because they're going to also get away with the resource, oil in the case of Nigeria and Igbo. So I really don't know. I wish that you asked the most difficult question, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Are there questions? Because I think we should take the time we have left.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, but
I was wondering if you could tell us about sort of anti-colonial struggle, like historically the anti-colonial struggle within Africa, and also maybe groups of people that were against exploitation and wage slavery and slavery and like this concept of property, maybe essentially capitalism.
sure, the anti-colonial movement really is born out of World War I. I mean, what you got is the two world wars were devastating to colonial power. In World War I, you've got all these Africans who are being sent for the first time. It coincides with the rise of Pan-Africanist ideology. There's this guy by the name of Edward Blyden, who's originally from the West Indies, but migrates to Sierra Leone. He really believes in the idea of creating this unified group that is Africa. They don't refer to Africa as a bunch of different colonial, but it's the country of Africa. So they got this idea of unification and solidarity of Africans. Those ideologies merge with African soldiers being from West Africa to East Africa, being sent to different parts. Them for the first time encountering Europeans fighting each other. Europeans bleed. They can be cowards. They're fallible. So all of a sudden there's a sense of empowerment that this is not ironclad, that Europe is not always going to control Africa. So in that sense, this idea of we can get out of this starts to develop, and that coincides later with labor rights, because labor continues to be exploited. Even though you got Africans who served their colonial masters during World War I, they expected to come home to better jobs, better wages, a better life in general. They didn't get any of that. What they got was more exploitation. So labor movements really rise up. I.T.A. Wallace Johnson, again in Sierra Leone, very, very powerful labor leader. And he also is the founder of the West Africa Youth League. So you've got political organizations and labor movements coming together with Pan-African ideas, and this idea that Europe is not invincible. And that sort of merges all the way up through into one of the biggest problems for colonization was Mussolini's invasion of Italy in 1935. Italy was this one place that was truly, Ethiopia was the independent part of it. That was the pride of Africa because it had never been colonized. They had fought off colonization by the Italians in 1896. But for Mussolini to then march in and take over was devastating. It was a huge propaganda coup in terms of Africans working together to get rid of Europe. And then World War II, you've got the Atlantic Charter, you've got Roosevelt, and you've got Churchill talking about rights, individual rights, and the fact that the Germans are acting like colonial powers taking over Europe. We need to be liberated. Well, fine, you're fighting a European war to free you. Why can't you free Africa too? So all these ideas really have a big impact on Africa itself. That's really sort of where the momentum builds and continues right up through. And Europe, of course, is devastated from the war. It can't maintain its colonial possessions. But the fact of the matter is, this is not to apologize for Europe, but decolonization happened faster than they expected. So I think a lot of the European powers were not prepared to hand over power to Africa. Africa was not prepared to take over power. So there's a very interesting debate by Julius Nyerere from Tanganyika, which becomes Tanzania, discussing, of course Africa wasn't ready for independence, but neither was America when it won it. You have to let these things play out and develop on their own time. And I think that's what we're in now. One of the questions I ask my students, I'm rambling, feel free to stop me whenever you want. One of the questions I ask my students is, think of Africa in 100 years. Now, try not to think of it in the now, but think of it in 100 years from now, where is it going to be? It's had its chance to overcome all these difficulties. 100 years is a lot of time to recover from. Remember, it wasn't even colonized for a full 100 years. It needs time to rebuild and develop itself. The question is, how is it going to be allowed to do that? I don't know if I answered your question or more than your question.
Are there any specific?
I'm sorry?
Any specific elements in African society that you would say, now Africa is modern in this sense. It is not modern in this sense. Or that there is no such thing as modern Africa. Modern or not modern, relative to who? To what? Or what terms?
This is the big challenge is modern is such a broad term. You need to, as with Jenny's talk, you need to have it in context. What modern are we talking about? And for Africa, does Africa have a different modern than European modern or North American modern? So it's very hard to define that.
You see, modern in terms of frame of mind, and not modern by way of the realities on the ground.
Mm.
So when I visit Africa, which is in Ethiopia, and arrive and reflect on the United States here, where I live, it's not modern.
Mhm.
Yes, there are people who have studied in the U.S. who live there, or universities and stuff, but development, or even, sense of fairness, if we define democracy as, self-respect for everyone,
Mhm.
I don't see.
In Ethiopia or in the United States?
Well, in Ethiopia,
I don't see it in the United States either.
well, you are blind.
In terms of respect,
Well, actually, when I say that, but yes, self-respect for everyone.
mhm.
Yes, there is. One can, list items, as I can go, drive around or go to restaurants, and I don't, elbow here or that, the customer. Sometimes, or I go to government office over there, and I don't get the same kind of respect or service, courtesy as I get here. So, this issue of modernity of Africa may be what you said in 100 years. When all the living Africans are all gone, and the new ones who shall have been born, then maybe there will be modern Africa. But yeah, so we talk about modern Africa, I do too, in terms of current, geography, and nation states, and that exists, but there are many ways many yardsticks to measure modernity. I'm sorry I took
No.
that long.
I agree with you. It's very hard to define your terms.
And I'm not quite sure how that, but it picks up on what we've just been talking about what is modern Africa and what's real. All I know about Africa is what I read, the pictures that I see, and I always have a question about is what I'm showing in the U.S., what's real, what is reality. I recently, I don't know, on Facebook, and someone posted, one of my friends posted yesterday, a clip of the Africa they never show you. And actually it shows all the modern cities. You find skyscrapers, you find cities that look like things that you see here in the West. So I'm struck by this conversation about Africa not being modern when there's something there. But even because you started listening to us with Ebola, about why Ebola, and I was telling Jenny yesterday, our reaction to this in terms of this reality. We've had Ebola here before. It was polio. And so when you have this big epidemic here in the West, but Ebola is described as though something it's Africa.
Yeah.
It's there. It couldn't happen anywhere else. We believe it happens there, but that's not so. So I'm just struck in terms of what's real. What we see here, what's real in Africa, what in terms of what we've been told, the modern, just things have happened there, but I don't know, that's probably the best way I can describe.
I guess to me what's real is, because you're absolutely right, and you look and you go on the internet and you can find pictures of in Nairobi and Johannesburg and Freetown. They're all very modern looking cities. But then you get on the ground and what's real from the picture and what's real on the ground are two very different stories. You don't have, in a US city, you don't have, for the most part, I mean, I realize there are parts of some cities in the States where you would have open sewage, but in these nice looking modern African cities, you very frequently will have open sewage. You'll have, infrastructure that doesn't hold up. But, Sierra Leone, Freetown, you can pretty much set your clock by when the power goes out. There is not a hotel that I've ever been to that doesn't have generators that basically run pretty much the whole city. So that kind of modernity, if you can equalize it with reliability, is different from, the trappings of appearance. I don't know if that...
But I would just follow up on that it makes, when you raise that kind of an issue about what is the place, what is the reality, what is the lived experience, and it makes you, I'm a white American who spent a lot of time in Africa. We have an African who lives in the United States and an African American, and all the rest of us, we all have our own lenses.
Yeah.
But when I come back to the U.S. after being in Africa, one of the things that gets me is all the different worlds that are in this world that I live in. And yeah, we don't have open sewage, but we have no electrification in Navajo. We have pockets of the developing world in every state in the U.S. And in certain states like this one, we have bigger pockets. They're almost more than pockets. So it's really amazing. But I was just in Nairobi and Bujumbura. So Nairobi is a city of I think 6 million, roughly. Some people say it's more 8 million, but something like that. And Bujumbura is a city of 1 million. And so I was trying to describe to friends, like, Nairobi is like New York City. So what does that make Bujumbura? I guess it's kind of like Albuquerque in a way. So it's in Africa, but you're not just thinking about developing world versus not developing world. What kind of a city is it? Is it hyper-urban? Nairobi is hyper-urban. So it has huge wealth and huge poverty, and the juxtaposition is unbelievable. The city that has the most extreme juxtaposition in the world is probably Johannesburg. And after that is probably Rio de Janeiro. So there's places, so I'm always struck by what I learn about my own perception of reality, class especially, differences in my own country by going to Africa. Because, so that you made this great point about the othering, that us and them, and one of the great things about traveling for all of us, who have traveled or who haven't traveled or who want to travel more, is that one of the experiences you can have is building walls between you and others, but another you can have is the othering goes away. It can go away, or it can be lessened, because you are open and because you are experiencing commonality. And even seeing, like, we have our own colonial projects in the United States. We had genocide in this country. We had slavery in this country. So, we're not so different. Human beings are not so different. So that's like a kind of an optimistic way maybe to think about it, is that when we move forward, we all have to do these things, not just Africa. We all have to work on these things.
But if I could add, going back to your talk, and you said lessons from Africa, the historical justice, social justice reparations, I cannot think immediately of Western European or American examples that are so forward-thinking in repairing the broken social fabric. So I think, unless there are, maybe Northern Ireland, perhaps.
Yes.
But in terms of examples, of course, it's South Africa that comes to mind, and then these ones, or in the Native American communities here.
And what about
right?
reparations for slavery in the United States? The calls for the reparations movement that we don't tend to, doesn't tend to get honored as
That's
being
right.
something that is equally compelling, but
So to me, this is a really bright light of handling tragedy in a positive way. But I also realize we do need to give people a chance maybe with another class